A federal appeals court just delivered a devastating blow to President Trump's economic agenda, and the implications could reshape American trade policy forever. While the world debates immigration and foreign policy, a quiet legal battle has been raging in federal courtrooms that could determine whether any president can bypass Congress and impose sweeping taxes on American consumers. We're talking about Trump's massive tariff program, the cornerstone of his second-term economic strategy, which has just been ruled largely illegal by one of the most important courts in America. So what exactly happened, and why does this decision threaten to unravel not just Trump's trade deals, but his entire approach to presidential power? To understand the magnitude of this ruling, we need to rewind to April 2nd, 2025, what Trump dramatically called Liberation Day. On that day, Trump announced sweeping tariffs on virtually every country on Earth, claiming he was liberating America from unfair trade practices. These weren't just modest adjustments to existing trade policy. Trump imposed a staggering 145% tariff on most Chinese imports, 25% tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico, and 10% tariffs on products from nearly every other nation. The scope was unprecedented in modern American history. But here's where it gets legally explosive. Trump didn't go through Congress to impose these taxes. Instead, he invoked the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, a law designed for genuine national emergencies like terrorism or foreign invasions. Trump declared America's long-standing trade deficits a national emergency and claimed this gave him unlimited power to impose tariffs without congressional approval. Think about that for a moment. Trump essentially argued that because America imports more than it exports, something that's been true for decades, he could unilaterally impose massive taxes on American consumers. The constitutional problem with this approach is enormous. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution explicitly grants Congress, not the president, the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, and to regulate commerce with foreign nations. The Founding Fathers were crystal clear. Taxation is a legislative power, not an executive one. They had just fought a revolution against a king who imposed taxes without representation, and they weren't about to give an American president the same authority. But Trump's legal team had a different interpretation. They pointed to the 1977 Emergency Powers Law and argued that Congress had already granted the president authority to act unilaterally in genuine emergencies. Their precedent? President Nixon's 1971 decision to impose temporary tariffs during an economic crisis, though even Nixon's actions were far more limited in scope and duration than Trump's sweeping global program. This is where two separate groups of challengers entered the picture, setting up what would become one of the most important economic cases in decades. The first challenge came from a coalition of businesses led by attorney Neil Katyal, the former acting Solicitor General who has argued over 50 cases before the Supreme Court. The second came from a group of states led by Oregon Attorney General Dan Rayfield, representing millions of Americans who would bear the cost of these tariffs through higher prices. Katyal, quote, S argument was constitutionally devastating in its simplicity. He told the courts that Trump's interpretation of emergency powers would essentially allow any president to do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, for as long as he wants, simply by declaring a national emergency. This wasn't just about trade policy, it was about the fundamental balance of power in American government. If Trump could bypass Congress on tariffs by claiming an emergency, what would stop future presidents from using the same logic to impose any policy they wanted? Meanwhile, Oregon's Dan Rayfield focused on the human cost of these tariffs. His state's analysis showed that Trump's tariffs would raise the cost of living for the average Oregon family by more than $3,800 per year, essentially imposing a sales tax in a state that has repeatedly rejected sales taxes at the ballot box. Rayfield argued that about 70% to 80% of tariff costs are ultimately paid by American consumers, not foreign governments, making them what he called regressive taxes that hit working families hardest. The stakes couldn't have been higher. By the time the case reached the appeals court, Trump's tariff program was generating about $30 billion per month in revenue, more than double the previous year's levels. The administration had used these tariffs not just to raise money, but as a negotiating weapon, forcing countries like the United Kingdom, Japan, and the European Union into what critics called lopsided trade deals to avoid even higher tariffs. Interestingly, the Trump administration's approach wasn't limited to traditional trade disputes. Behind the scenes, there were reports of personal grievances influencing policy decisions. Some analysts suggested that Trump's particularly harsh stance toward certain countries stemmed from diplomatic slights or failed attempts at mediation in regional conflicts. This personalization of trade policy added another layer of unpredictability to an already volatile situation. In May 2025, the specialized U.S. Court of International Trade delivered the first major blow to Trump's program, ruling that the president had exceeded his authority under IEPA. The court found that the Emergency Powers Law simply doesn't mention tariffs anywhere in its text, and that no previous president had tried to use it for such sweeping trade measures. But Trump's team immediately appealed, setting up a showdown at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. The oral arguments in July revealed just how skeptical the appeals court judges were of Trump's claims. One judge pointedly asked how trade deficits could constitute an extraordinary and unusual threat when America has had trade deficits for decades. Another noted that IEPA doesn't even mention tariffs anywhere in its text. The judges seemed particularly troubled by the unprecedented scope of Trump's actions, affecting 69% of all U.S. imports compared to the narrow, temporary measures taken by previous presidents. Then came Friday's bombshell decision. In a 7-4 ruling, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit struck down most of Trump's tariffs, delivering what legal experts called a sweeping rebuke of presidential power. The majority opinion was unequivocal. It seems unlikely that Congress intended to grant the president unlimited authority to impose tariffs. The court affirmed that tariffs are a core congressional power and that Trump's actions were invalid as contrary to law. But here's the strategic twist that makes this decision even more significant. The court delayed implementation of its ruling until October, giving Trump time to appeal to the Supreme Court. This wasn't mercy. It was recognition that the case involves such fundamental questions about presidential power that it almost certainly belongs before the nation's highest court. Trump's reaction was predictably explosive. He called the appeals court highly partisan and claimed on Truth Social that if the decision stands, it would literally destroy the United States of America. His trade advisor, Peter Navarro, went even further, calling it arguably the single most important economic case that has ever come before the Supreme Court, and claiming it would mean the end of the United States if upheld. Navarro's rhetoric has been particularly inflammatory throughout this trade war. In various media appearances, he's made controversial statements targeting specific countries and even invoking divisive social and cultural references in attempts to justify the administration's policies. These comments have drawn condemnation from both domestic and international observers, who see them as counterproductive to legitimate trade negotiations. But the legal experts who won the case saw it very differently. Neil Katyal called the decision a win for our Constitution and founders' vision of what America is, emphasizing that it protects the fundamental principle that presidents must act within the rule of law. Oregon's Dan Rayfield was equally emphatic, calling it a victory not just for Oregon, but for working families, small businesses, and everyday Americans. The economic implications of this ruling are staggering. If the Supreme Court upholds the decision, Trump would lose his most powerful trade negotiating tool and potentially face demands to refund billions in tariff revenue already collected.
India won't budge, Trump won't either. So this is a rather stark statement, a controversial one also at that has been made by Kevin Hassett. He's the director of National Economic Council of the United States. He, while speaking to reporters, has said that US President Donald Trump won't be offering a concession on the 50% tariffs that have been slapped against India, which come into effect from today should India continue buying oil at cheaper rates from Russia. Let's take a look.
complicated.
It is a complicated relationship, that it's integrated some with the problems that we're trying to put extra pressure on Russia so that we can get a peace deal to save millions of lives, and the Indian intransigence about opening their markets to our products. And so I think that when you're looking at trade negotiations, one thing I think we've all learned is that you need to keep your eyes on the horizon and recognize that there are going to be ebbs and flows in things before we reach the final position.
Countries that agreed to trade deals under the threat of even higher tariffs might seek to renegotiate or delay implementation of their commitments. The entire foundation of Trump's America First trade strategy could crumble. Meanwhile, the international response has been telling. Some nations have begun exploring alternative partnerships and trade arrangements, recognizing that American trade policy has become increasingly unpredictable. Economic experts have noted that America is desperately trying various tactics from cajoling to threatening to prevent countries from aligning with alternative economic blocs.
Would use the adjective desperate. This attack on Modi is part of the desperation. You'll see it in sending troops into downtown Washington, D.C., or threatening Chicago and New York, our major cities, with an influx of military to control a crime problem which the mayor and the chief of police in both those cities say doesn't exist. You're seeing contradictions inside the United States that I, with my white hair, and I've been born and lived in America all my life, I've never seen. So don't misunderstand this as a carefully tabulated, calculated, strategic move. This is desperation. You couldn't get India to do what you wanted one way. You're now going to try another. And that's all it is. And it will be dropped as quickly as it arose.
So at what point?
However, these heavy-handed approaches may be having the opposite effect, pushing nations to seek more stable partnerships elsewhere. The current situation reflects what some analysts describe as desperation rather than calculated strategy. There are unprecedented internal divisions within America, with states not communicating due to deep hostility, and Trump even threatening to send military troops into major cities like Chicago and New York for crime problems that local officials say don't exist.
According to a Bloomberg report, Chinese President Xi Jinping wrote a secret letter to Indian officials amid the Trump tariff showdown. Xi's letter raised concerns about any U.S. trade deals that would harm China's interests, helped pave way for improved Beijing-Delhi ties, is the pitch that is coming in from this Bloomberg report, where it seems that the Trump tariff storm has led to this new power dynamic between India and China, where China is looking to India not as an adversary, as we saw after the Galwan clash, but as someone to partner with to weather this entire storm, to create a stable economic order in Asia, is the pitch that's coming in from this Bloomberg report. And I'm joined by my colleague Anand Narasimhan on the broadcast. So Anand, clearly this indicates what we've been seeing, the signs in the past few weeks, where China now wants to partner with India to weather this entire storm, pretty much create that kind of alliance within the BRICS nations to take on this mercurial economic policy coming out of the Trump administration.
These contradictions reveal a deeper crisis in American governance that extends beyond trade policy. Notably, the tariff controversy has created strange bedfellows in opposition to Trump's policies. Both Democrats and Republicans have now criticized the targeting of specific countries with punitive tariffs while ignoring larger trade imbalances with others.
The core is they're slamming the US president for targeting India, their words, and they've made this in a few different statements. We're just going to bring you more context over here to bring you the understanding of how the Democrats are dealing with this right now in the United States. We'll bring you more context in just a second. We'll also have reporters joining us. This was a Democratic panel. These were Democratic members of the U.S. Foreign Affairs Committee that raised sharp questions over President Donald Trump's decision to impose a 50% tariff on India for continuing oil imports. They've said that instead of imposing sanctions on China or purchasing larger amounts of Russian oil and others, those who are purchasing larger amounts, you're singling out India. Tariffs, you're hurting Americans, you're sabotaging the US-India relationship in the process. This was part of their larger statement. This was a statement that was put out, as we told you a little while earlier. But these remarks also in sharp contrast to what we saw the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent say a little earlier, and we'll focus on that too. But let's take a look at how the Indian economy is standing right now. Okay, what is the initial data coming in? S&P upgrades.
This bipartisan concern suggests that even within Trump's own party, there's recognition that the current approach may be doing more harm than good to American interests. Some administration officials have reportedly linked trade policies to personal grievances, with reports suggesting that certain tariff decisions stem from bruised ego and unreasonable statements, including the 50% tariff threats against nations that refuse to accommodate Trump's diplomatic initiatives.
Still issue with Donald Trump. It's like he has a personal angst. Maybe his ego has been bruised in some quarter, and therefore he's often coming up with these kind of unreasonable statements as far as fixing the tariff rate. I mean, who talks about a 50% tariff being imposed on India when Indian-American relationships have been good? Who talks about trying to teach us a lesson because we are buying Russian oil when America itself buys Russian uranium or energy and Russian gas as well. So they see that there is a kind of a personal or an ego battle which is happening here. But Indian and American relationships have been something which have been very, very old. Sometimes blow hot, blow cold. But even Donald Trump had a very good equation with the Prime Minister, and on many platforms Donald Trump himself has referred to this fact as well. So I don't think India would want to sour our equations with America, but clearly sending out a message is that we are not going to buckle under any pressure.
Oh, absolutely.
This personalization of policy has alarmed traditional foreign policy experts who worry about the long-term damage to America's credibility. But there's also a deeper constitutional principle at stake here. The case represents a fundamental test of presidential power in the modern era. For decades, Congress has gradually ceded more and more authority to the executive branch, allowing presidents to act unilaterally on everything from military deployments to regulatory policy. Trump's tariff program represents perhaps the most aggressive expansion of presidential power in economic policy since the New Deal era. The Supreme Court that will likely hear this case is the same court that has been expanding presidential power in other areas while also developing the major questions doctrine. The principle that executive agencies need clear congressional authorization to carry out policies of significant economic and political importance. The tension between these two trends could determine not just the fate of Trump's tariffs, but the balance of power between Congress and the presidency for generations to come. Meanwhile, Trump isn't sitting idle while waiting for the Supreme Court. His administration is already exploring alternative legal authorities for imposing tariffs, including Section 232 national security provisions and Section 301 unfair trade practice measures. These laws have more procedural requirements and limitations, but they could allow Trump to maintain some tariff pressure even if his IEPA-based program is permanently struck down. For American consumers and businesses, the uncertainty is perhaps the most damaging aspect of this entire saga. Companies have spent months adjusting supply chains, renegotiating contracts, and passing costs on to consumers based on tariffs that might not have been legal in the first place. The economic disruption goes far beyond the direct cost of the tariffs themselves. The case also highlights a broader trend in American governance, the increasing judicialization of political disputes. Rather than working through Congress to build consensus on trade policy, Trump chose to act unilaterally and let the courts sort out the constitutional questions. This approach might deliver short-term political victories, but it creates long-term legal vulnerabilities that can unravel entire policy programs. As we await the Supreme Court's decision, one thing is clear. This case will be remembered as a defining moment in the ongoing struggle over presidential power. Whether Trump's vision of an all-powerful executive prevails, or whether the courts reassert Congress's constitutional role in economic policy, will shape American governance for decades to come. The stakes extend far beyond trade policy. If presidents can bypass Congress on taxation by simply declaring emergencies, the entire system of checks and balances that the founders designed could be fundamentally altered. That quote asks why this case matters not just for Trump's political agenda, but for the future of American democracy itself. Dot, the Supreme Court will ultimately decide whether we live under a system of laws or a system where presidential will can override constitutional constraints. Dot, and that decision will echo through American history long after the current political battles are forgotten.